Thanks so much for coming here, guys. I can't believe you chose me over Instagram and TikTok. I know I probably would have chosen them over me, but I appreciate you all humoring me and coming. So today, I hope today's really interesting. I hope today's really fun and exciting, and that my jet lag does not kick my ass during the presentation. So let's start off. One of my favorite things to say when I do one of these presentations is I've got the future CMOs or current CMOs of the world here. And some people might say I'm full of it, that I don't know what I'm talking about. But I think if you actually look at the data, it tells the story that I'm telling, which is over the last 10 years, you've seen influencer marketing grow 29x. And there are not many things in the world that grow 29x in a 10-year time span. And despite growing 29x over the last 10 years, I think there's still significant room to grow. So if you're to look at influencer marketing versus magazine advertising, television advertising, radio advertising, it is obviously dramatically outpacing them in terms of growth over the last 10 years, but still has a lot of room to go up, right? And so for today, what my goals are, right? Obviously, everybody here is focused on influencer marketing. And I think when you think about what our job is as an organization, half of our job is to create the software and the tools and the metrics and the data and that kind of stuff. But the other half of our job is to help you guys figure out like how this stuff actually works, right? And the way that we figure out how this stuff works is by observing the best brands in the world and what they're doing and try to figure out what the patterns are. So for today, that's really my goal, is to cover what are the patterns that we've observed across these brands that have really killed it. And then the second part of it, and this was discussed a lot in the panel with Wella and Fable and Main and with Olaplex, is I think the impact that this is having is still dramatically underestimated. And so my goal today is to prove that to you and also to help you prove it to your bosses and to the world. So that's a plan. Everybody feel good? All right, let's do it. Okay, so the first thing that we learned in terms of influencers is that this isn't about going out and finding Kim Kardashian and paying her to talk about you, right? So when you're looking at the brands that have done this really well, they're not working with one influencer or 10 influencers. They have tens of thousands, occasionally hundreds of thousands of influencers that are creating tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of pieces of content. So if you're to look at some of these brands like a Spotify, an Elf, a YSL, an ASOS, like these are massive communities, and the relationships that these brands are building with these influencers are deep and interconnected and long-term. And so when you're looking at these programs, the thing that we have observed is this is not about working with dozens, this is about working with thousands. The second thing that we learned is in terms of working with these influencers, I think people often wait until these influencers are really big, right, to actually pay attention to them. But when we look at the brands that have done this very successfully, they actually tend to outperform with the little guys, with the micro-influencers. And the reason for this is twofold, right? So one, I think when they're really little, like when somebody's got millions of fans and you reach out to them, of course you want to work with them. But if you start building a relationship early on, it's much more genuine, it's much more authentic. And I think the second reason is when you invest in those little guys, eventually some of those grow up to be much bigger guys. So the way that that graduation rate works is about 1 out of every 20 influencers that are between 0 and 100,000 fans will graduate each year, right? They'll go past 100,000 fans. And then once they get past 100,000 fans, it's kind of like a rock rolling downhill where they professionalize, they go full time, often they quit their jobs. And so you see 1 out of every 4 will surpass 300,000 fans the next year, and 1 out of every 3 will surpass 1 million fans the following year. And so when you're investing in these little guys, obviously they are more genuine, they are more authentic, you're gonna form a deeper connection, but you're also investing in the future, right? You wanna build a relationship with Kim Kardashian when she's Paris Hilton's assistant, not today, right? Which, was a long time ago now. The other thing that's deeply connected here is if you look at the brands that have done this very well, they are forming long-term relationships. And what do I mean by a long-term relationship? A long-term relationship is 3 years, not 3 months, or even longer. So a good example of this is if you were to look at Lindsey Vonn, who's an Olympic skier. She has a couple million fans on Instagram. This is her relationship with Gucci over the last, call it 4.5 years. And if you were to look at that relationship, she did 1 post about them in 2019, 7 in 2020, 32 in 2021, and then 57 in 2022. And so you see this relationship evolve over that kind of long time horizon. And the way that relationship started was early on, she just wore the Gucci slides in the press. Then they started dressing her at major events and inviting her into campaigns. And then by 2022, they were doing a full collection together, a collaboration. They were having on a podcast, family dinner. And so this is how those relationships evolve. And this is the pattern that we see over and over and over again across brands and individual relationships. But this is not anecdotal, right? So if you look at the actual numbers, when you measure retention of influencers, it is far and away the most predictive metric we have for growth. And what do I mean by retention rates for influencers? So traditionally, when you talk about retention rates, you're talking about your customer. I bring a customer in, do I keep that customer? Can I turn them into a repeat customer? And if I've got, a 10% repurchase rate, it's going to be really hard to build a big company that way. Influencers are the same thing. And a real simple way to think about it for those that aren't in the influencer world day to day is, let's imagine I could get Vogue magazine to write an article about me. And this year they wrote 2 articles about me. Well, so I recruited Vogue. But my goal now is I want to retain Vogue. If they wrote 2 articles about me this year, I want them to write 4 articles about me next year and 8 articles the year after that. And so influencers operate very much the same way. And I'm showing it to you in the entertainment industry, but this is in the beauty industry. The R squared is about 0.96. You're not going to find many things in the world that are more predictive than that. This is it in the luxury industry, about 0.8, means about 80% of the problem. One of the brands that does this really, really well, and it's quite stellar, I don't know if Sarah's in the room from Olaplex. There she is. So she was one of the ones that's absolutely crushed this. She was a global CMO at Charlotte Tilbury during this time. Why did I say Olaplex? Jeez. Oh boy. Oh boy, gonna get myself in some trouble. So if you were to look at Charlotte Tilbury over the last 5 years, you can see their retention rates, 107, 113, 86, 93, 95, and the rankings are from number 21 to number 14 to all the way up to number 2 more recently. This is their global ranking in the makeup category, and this is after they'd already gotten acquired for $1 billion back in, I believe, 2019. And so this pattern we see again and again and again. One of the other speakers that'll be on stage today that's done a really good job of this fairly recently is Gymshark. Their retention rates within the European panel that we track, at 115%. They're the fastest growing brand across all of the athleisure category that we track, and obviously doing really well from a business perspective. So that's a third learning. This idea of long-term relationships and retention being incredibly critical to success. Does that make sense to people? All right, cool. The other thing that I think brands are doing, or that has changed, is that brands now have a larger audience than most of the publishers. And what I mean by that was we had a guy named Robert Chiefus, who was the CMO at Gucci at the time. He's now the CEO at Stone Island. And he said, he told Vogue, my audience as Gucci is now bigger than your audience. And how does that change things, right? And the way that it changes things, and the way that you see brands really leverage this effectively, is they start using their audience to help the influencers grow their audience, right? And so a good example of this would be Fashion Nova, right? So Fashion Nova obviously is not Gucci. It's a very different brand fundamentally, but they're the #1 brand we track in the entire apparel category in the United States. They do double the EMV of Nike, which most people know who Nike is, although apparently it's Nike out here. Still haven't gotten used to that one. But if you were to look at one of the things he said that was fascinating was that he estimates that 10% of the traffic to his website has no intention of ever buying a product, right? 10% of the people that come to his site. And he said the reason they come to the site is Fashion Nova releases new products all the time, right? Every day, these new collections. And they have to choose models for those collections. Well, the way that they choose those models is based upon who talks about them the most online. So if you talk about them all the time online, then you get chosen as a model for an upcoming collection. If you get chosen as a model for an upcoming collection, you're going to gain 10,000 fans on Instagram. And so you go, oh shit, if I talk about Fashion Nova, maybe I'll get featured. If I get featured, I'll gain 10,000 fans. So I'm going to talk more about Fashion Nova. And so the point of this is not for you to do that, but to just think about how do I leverage the traffic to my website, the traffic to my social channels, my in-store presence to help elevate the careers of these influencers and know that that will get paid back in kind. The other thing that we've observed is the best programs, when we look at the brands that have done this really well, they are in-house programs, meaning meaning the relationships are managed in-house by the brand. They have a team that is doing this. Now, this does not mean that they don't have an agency to support them. Actually, if you look at all the people that have our software, about half of them have an agency that actually logs into our software on their behalf to interact with these creators. But the agency should be in a support function, right? Not managing or owning the actual relationships themselves. You want to own those relationships if you can, or if you do bring an agency in, you want them to operate as if they are an in-house team member, so those relationships maintain with you. And this is actually something, this is not necessarily an observation of what the best brands are doing, although they are doing it. This is more an observation of something that we've seen that has changed. So when we first started, the goal was to get the content. I'm going to send them product. I'm going to invite them to an event. I might pay them. I'm going to build a relationship with them. And then I get the content, that generates EMV, exposure, impressions, whatever, great, done. The thing that we're noticing now is that's just kind of the starting point of the journey. What's happening now is those assets, that content is being used in a bunch of different marketing channels and is being shown to be highly effective in those channels. I think one of those in particular is ads. So if you're to look at something like Spark ads, where they're taking organic content, putting paid media behind it, those ads are just performing dramatically better, and it's the fastest growing business unit within TikTok. And these are stats, one of their recent presentations where they said creator content gets 5x the video completion rate and double the conversion rate of brand generated content. It's just working better, right? And so that's something that's changed. The other thing that's changed that's really interesting was early on, I think influencers were very much the kind of realm of the indie up and coming brand, right? They were the brand that was on the edge. They didn't really need a lot of measurement. They know it was working. And the enterprises largely stayed out. And I think that has really changed. So now you're seeing the larger companies globally go, oh, wow, I'm getting my ass kicked because I'm not doing this. Like, I need to catch up and I need to do it. The problem is that as a larger organization, you have more surface area and more risk. And so it becomes significantly more important to have the right compliance, standards, brand safety, et cetera, than say a small up and coming indie brand. To put that into perspective, if you were to look at somebody like Diageo, they've got 200 brands like Tanqueray, Guinness, Smirnoff, et cetera. They're in 180 countries. They've got all these different cultures across all these different brands. And then each one of those countries and brands has maybe hundreds to thousands of influencers that talk about them. And so working across that large of an ecosystem is both incredibly complex and has a lot of risk to it. And so that's another thing that we've seen change. Okay, so that's the learnings. Now I want to talk about why this matters and to prove to you why I think it's having a much bigger impact than most people are expecting. And I think this is one of my favorite ways that I think about it in my head. I don't know, I've always had this scene in my head for this particular category. You know, people talk in millions, I want to talk in billions. That's what I think actually matters here. And so I'll start with the content and then we'll get to the brand. So on the content side of things, this is a sample video from YouTube by a guy named Manny Mua, Manny the makeup artist. I would show you a more recent video, but unfortunately YouTube actually won't let you see this data anymore. I think it's partially because it was terrifying parents to know that their kids were spending so much time on YouTube. But if you're to look at this particular YouTube video, it got about 3 million views, which is a ton of views. But it actually got about half the watch time of a Super Bowl ad. It's about 50 years of time. So 5 full decades of time spent on this one YouTube video. And that Super Bowl ad would cost you about $7 million. And this is just one YouTube video, 3 million views. And this is not a statistical anomaly. This is very common for a video of that length. And so when you're looking at this content, the amount of time that people are spending on it is just incredible. And then secondarily, Wet n Wild, who this video is about, did not pay him to create this. And that is the vast majority of the content that we see created about brands. To me, 90 to 95% of the content is organic in nature. And frankly, I think organic content is going to be a lot more convincing than a paid ad anyways when it comes to having an impact. So that's the content side of things. Let's look at brands. And we're going to start at the top of the top of the top of the top, right? This is Amazon, the #1 brand we track globally. Has anybody heard of Amazon? Raise your hand. So they're the #1 brand we track globally with influencers. They've had a little over 5 million pieces of content created about them by influencers since 2019 across a couple 100,000 influencers and about $21 billion in EMV. To put that number into perspective, that would be the equivalent of buying out every single Super Bowl ad, right? So there's 100 ads a year, 7 million apiece, every year for the next 1,400 years in a row, right? That's how much time it is. You're 3,400 and whatever, right? And so it's just crazy. And it's really hard to kind of soak in. But in terms of the actual impact it's having, I think where it gets really interesting is, and this is a fairly old school method that we're now applying in kind of a new school way, is generally the number of people talking about you should equal the number of people buying you. So your share of voice should equal your share of market. And when those two things are off, that's when it becomes very predictive of future gains in market share. So as an example, Amazon in 2019 had about 70% of the share of voice versus their competitive set, and only about 30% of the market, right? 30% of the actual revenue. So there's way more buzz than there was revenue. And so what you find is when those two things are off, they tend to even out. So like over that time, Amazon went from about 30% market share up to about 40% market share. And this is market share in terms of, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. It's actually, frankly, trillions of dollars collectively. There's a massive shift, right? During that time span, they gained about $281 billion in revenue over that time. And I expect it to continue, right? They're still not where they should be. And so, okay, so that's Amazon. But obviously, there's only really one Amazon globally in terms of e-com. You guys are on Amazon, let's keep going. When we look at the next one, let's look at Skims, right? So Skims went from that's a brand co-founded by Kim Kardashian, went from number 174 in our rankings to number 37 to number 18 to number 10 to number 9. They went from a $1.6 billion valuation in 2021 to a $4 billion valuation in 2023. Did about $750 million in revenue. They did close to $1 billion in EMV over that time across a couple 100,000 pieces of content. And again, so you can see the impact. We look at Prime. So obviously we don't have Kim Kardashian in our brand. Let's look at another brand. Prime just passed Gatorade in EMV in 2022. They did $250 million in revenue in their first year, did $1.2 billion in revenue in their second year, which I don't know if anybody's ever had that kind of growth trajectory. If we look at Spotify versus Apple Music, Spotify has doubled their EMV over the last 18 months. They're absolutely blowing up when it comes to influencers. Their stock price has doubled over the last year to a market cap of $58 billion. Let's look at Barbie. Barbie did $1 billion in EMV in a single month. They gained $2 billion in market cap at Mattel. It is the #1 movie of all time by box office ticket sales for a female-directed movie. Did over $1 billion, $1.4 billion at the box office. Look at Alo Yoga. They went from number 15 to number 10 to number 8, past Lululemon, past most of the other athleisure brands other than Gymshark in terms of EMV, past $1 billion in revenue, growing 32% year over year. If you look at LVMH, they blow the competition out of the water within the luxury sector when it comes to influencers. They went from about 30% market share on the luxury side to a little over 43%. They own almost half the conversation when it comes to luxury. Over that time span from 2019 to 2023, they've gained $300 billion in market cap, doubled the returns of the S&P 500, 2.5x the returns of their rivals. One of the best examples of this is Tiffany. So Tiffany, prior to being acquired by LVMH, was very much moving in the wrong direction with influencers. We're dropping in their rankings from number 60 to number 72. And then over the last 4 years, post-acquisition, they went all the way up to our top 20 in all of apparel and are now the #1 watches and jewelry brand globally that we track according to influencers. During that time, they have doubled profits pre-acquisition since before the acquisition and doubled revenue. If you were to look at Naturium, which was an acquisition by e.l.f., who's going to be speaking later, they got acquired for $355 million. You can see their EMV chart. I'd love if all my charts looked like that. They don't. Some of them do, but not all of them. If you were to look at another speaker that we have here, L'Occitane, that portfolio is absolutely on fire. Every single one of their brands within that portfolio is gaining rank, both within Europe and more broadly. And if you look at the impact I believe that is having on the business, they have almost doubled their growth rate from last year, 2022 to 2023. So their revenue growth rate is up about 80% year over year. If you look at Adidas, Adidas has passed Nike when it comes to influencers within Europe as well as within the US. They're up 29% in EMV in Europe over the last 6 months. Their stock price is up 42%, while Nike's is down about 30%, which again, we're talking about billions, right? Tens of billions, not millions. And if we were to look at Cezanne, this brand is, it's insane. We don't have any revenue data on it. The only stuff we have is apparently they're at 250 million euros in 2021, but their EMV is up 114% year over year. From what I know from insiders, is absolutely exploding in revenue. I think my final one, because I think it illustrates kind of the approach that I would recommend, is Rare Beauty. So the #1 brand we tracked in the US when it came to influencers, growing really rapidly in Europe as well. And the reason I like to highlight them, and from a revenue perspective, they're supposedly growing close to 200% year over year, up to, I believe, 300 million in estimated revenue. I think they're seeking a $2 billion valuation globally. And I think the reason that they're so interesting is this gets back to this concept of long-term relationships. So the team that built Rare Beauty is also the team that built NYX Cosmetics. NYX Cosmetics was the first brand that we ever paid attention to that was blowing up in the data, that then went on to get acquired for $500 million by L'Oreal. And that team that built all of those influencer relationships at NYX a decade ago brought all of those with them to Rare Beauty, right? So the CEO at NYX is a CEO at Rare. The CDO at NYX is a CDO at Rare. The chief product officer at NYX is a chief product officer at Rare. And so those relationships were built not just over a month or over a year, but built over 10 years. And so hopefully everybody in this room is, thinking of this not as something that's a short-term thing, but as something that you invest in and should pay back over the kind of the lifetime of your career. And with that, I am done.